Welcome everyone, I'm Adeshewa Josh and this is Africa Matters. African leaders met and adopted the Nairobi Declaration in Kenya. We'll look at how their proposals for new global taxes and financial systems reform will help to address the issue of climate change financing across the continent. Who pays African countries for the deadly impact of climate change caused by major polluters of the planet, and how? Those were some of the questions delegates grappled with at the continent's first ever climate change summit held in Nairobi, Kenya. There were also varying views about how to get money to pay for increasingly extreme weather and developing renewable energy while conserving natural resources. In the end, African leaders adopted the Nairobi Declaration, as Anne Masharia explains.
In the heart of Nairobi's vibrant market, we meet Maureen, not just a fishmonger, but a symbol of unwavering resilience and adaptability. Maureen's livelihood depends on frying her fish with firewood, a method steeped on tradition, passed down through generations. But in our ever-changing climate, tradition comes at an ever-increasing cost. It's becoming more expensive to secure the firewood she so desperately needs. Yet, it's not just about economics. It's a stark reminder that climate change is a relentless and immediate reality for millions, especially in vulnerable communities like ours.
Firewood is affordable and quickly accessible. You won't stay there for long. You can inspect those firewood pieces, you gather them and sit for a while, then return there. But electricity cannot be used for cooking fish. Yes, many people nowadays use it, but for me, since I've been using this method for a long time, I find firewood to be just fine.
It's one of the pressing climate challenges discussed at the first Africa Climate Summit held in Nairobi, where African leaders argued that they not only face the biggest threat from climate change, but also offer opportunities for green investment like this one signed at the summit.
Notable highlights include a transformative partnership investing $60 million over 2 years in expanding grid access in rural Burundi, a $4.5 billion commitment from the UAE, represented here by my brother, to boost renewable energy, substantial contribution from the European nations, and significant investments from the private sector, emphasizing renewable energy initiatives.
But the continent only receives 12% of the financing it needs to cope with climate shocks. The final declaration called on major polluters to commit more resources to help poorer nations. They also proposed a global carbon taxation regime that would include a carbon tax on fossil fuel trade, maritime transport, and aviation, among others. African leaders are also pushing for a new global climate finance charter by 2025 that would lower borrowing costs and allow for money to respond to the impact of climate change. They also call for measures to help indebted countries avoid defaults, such as granting 10-year grace periods. The question of climate funding is likely to continue beyond the Africa Climate Summit, but the stories of resilience and adaptation reminds us of Africa's potential as a green energy powerhouse is greater than ever. Anne Masharia, Africa Matters, Nairobi.
Let's hear more from Olivia Rumble, an advisor at African Climate Foundation. She joins me from Cape Town, South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us. First of all, what's your assessment of the Nairobi Declaration adopted at the Africa Climate Summit?
I think we can be proud and celebrate that such a large regional bloc and so many countries were able to come together over a really short period of time and condense some quite complicated and nuanced topics into a declaration that will, I think, really empower African countries going towards COP28.
Should African countries rely on funding pledges from Western countries to develop its green energy sector, seeing that $100 billion pledged annually 14 years ago hasn't even been remitted at all?
That's a great question, and one that African countries have been asking for many, many years. I think the developed world has come close to that number. I think we are likely to hit that number, or at least there have been statements made that that number will be reached during the course of this year. But for sure, historically, it hasn't been reached. I suppose to answer your question, that funding is necessary. It plays a very important catalytic role in getting projects off the ground, de-risking them, and attracting in other private capital. So absolutely, we can rely on African governments to some degree to try and set aside finance to bring in renewable energy, but the role of donor funding is still really relevant and important. I think what African countries, though, are looking to see is not just donor funding, but a fundamental change to the overarching debt architecture that has shackled them into being forced to spend most of their GDP on servicing debt instead of spending those funds on renewable energy or adaptation or loss and damage.
Isn't it then critical to ask if there is anything that African leaders can do to hold wealthier countries who are the highest polluters of our continent to remit their pledges? Conferences like COP28 and the Paris Agreement have not been honored, as I mentioned earlier. What makes you think that the Africa Climate Summit would do any better?
That's what makes global politics so interesting and so frustrating at the same time, because it is ultimately a matter of negotiations and an agreement and discussion and consensus between parties about what they're able to do and their political will to implement those promises and undertakings. And for sure, that does lead to a large degree of frustration when those promises aren't kept. But it's important to have that dialogue and conversation and to at least chart a way forward. When it comes to the Nairobi Declaration, I think I was discussing it with someone yesterday. It's not just the outcome document, but it's the process that is so extremely important. The fact that African countries were able to sit down and arrive at a consensus between them, because we're a very, very large continent with many, many diverse views and positions on these issues. So to have consensus around them and a direction on the way forward and agreement on what the asks of the global community are is a really, really important step. And if you read the Nairobi Declaration, it's not high level. It goes into quite extreme detail on the type of reforms of trade, tax, all of those things. So I think it's an important and timely discussion to have.
Olivia, yes, indeed. I have read the declaration, and I think the line that jumps at me is the part where African leaders are asking wealthier countries to restructure the financing, the global financing system, to allow them borrow for less. Would you say there is a parallel between the pledges and the funding pledges that have not been remitted and the idea that African countries are seeking to lessen their debt burden, so that at least, if you can't give us the money, then we can at least owe you less, so we can use whatever money we have in reserve to fund our own projects. Do you think?
That's a beautiful way to put it. That's exactly what African countries are asking for. So they're doing both. They're saying, please live up to the pledges that you made, but even if you can't, let's really look at the way that African countries are paying for the loans that they're being required to take out, because a lot of climate finance is not being given in the form of grants, it's in the form of loans and on very concessional terms, extremely high interest rates, like 5 times what other developed countries are necessarily paying. So if African countries can be freed up and liberated in this way, they can spend on climate within their own domestic autonomous priorities, so they can do it on their own terms without having to focus not only on debt repayments, but on the interest as well.
So, Olivia, you're a legal practitioner, and as far as I understand the law, I know that pledges are not legally binding. Is there any other way that Africans can raise their own funding? For example, being in control or place premium on the things they're in control of. You're not in control of other people's promises. Well, perhaps you're in control of your mineral resources and other things that the West wants from the continent, and then place a premium on that to raise funding for some of the projects that we know will harness our green potential. What do you think?
Great idea, and maybe you've also had some legal training, I can't tell. But yeah, absolutely. There is a legal liability arising to the provision of finance under the Paris Agreement, but moving beyond that, absolutely, I think a couple of African countries are looking to see how can we capitalize on the resources that we have at home. Some are saying we're going to place export bans on manufactured mineral exports, so forcing countries that are trying to find green critical minerals on the African continent to beneficiate those and process them so that Africa can itself also benefit from that manufacturing and development and job growth and all of the things that come with development of mineral infrastructure.
So climate activists are pushing for African solutions to the climate crisis. What should that look like? And what kind of funding model could work?
That's a big but very interesting question. I think if you watched some of the proceedings around the Nairobi summit, you would have seen that there was, I think, about 500 people protesting outside. Youth for Climate Suits, those legal actions that have sprung up across the world, are incredibly popular, in my view, extremely effective, depending on the court. There was recently a judgment out of Montana in the US finding in favor of a group of youth activists on the basis of their constitutional rights to a healthy environment. And we're seeing similar cases crop up all over the developed and developing world. So, maybe I'm a bit biased as a lawyer, but I'm a big fan of the courts and the role that the youth have played in trying to pursue a ambitious agenda within them and getting them to nudge their governments ahead that way.
Thank you so much, Olivia Rumble, an advisor at the Africa Climate Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us from Cape Town, South Africa. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me.
The African continent is home to 1.3 billion people, and it accounts for less than 4% of global carbon emissions. Yet, it faces some of the worst effects. That's one of the reasons why Africans are calling for accountability and financial support in the fight against climate change. But what are the needs in their own countries, and what are African leaders doing to address them? Our correspondents in Accra, Mogadishu, and Lusaka went to the streets to find out.
The impact of climate change is real in Ghana, just like any part of the continent of Africa. We are talking about impact in the area of agriculture, where farmers are recording low yields because of extreme weather patterns or conditions. We're talking about flooding in parts of the country, and water bodies like this are drying out. Now, the government has said that it is committed to fighting climate change, and so it's rolling out several programs, including the famous Green Ghana, a campaign where government is encouraging people to plant trees so that the forest reserves that have been depleted can be recovered. But not everyone is impressed with government's efforts so far.
The government is not committed, frankly, because it's one thing to say you are fighting it or you will do it, and then it's one thing to implement what you say you're going to do. So, for example, let's look at deforestation. We know there is this forest called the Etiwa forest, for example. And for the past years, it's been up and down, government, activists. Now we don't even know who is telling the truth or who is not.
It's not only government that is trying to fight the impact of climate change. There are several individuals who are playing their roles in their little ways to deal with the situation. For example, going to schools, trying to talk to young people to have better attitude towards the environment.
We've been doing this for the past 2 to 3 years. And this has really transformed how these kids engage in schools and how they are able to learn the things they learn. The mindset they've now changed from a mindset of not conserving the environment to a place of now conserving the environment and making sure that their daily habits conform with the standards of the world and making sure they are very sustainable.
It is yet to be seen how these various efforts by government and individuals will bring about positive change in dealing with climate change. But if that change will come, people are hoping that it happens sooner rather than later.
Somalia is suffering from acute humanitarian crisis on earth. A crushing combination of conflict and climate change has left millions in jeopardy of starvation. The country is suffering from climate crisis it has done nothing to create. This is one of the makeshift houses where climate refugees live in the city. Extreme drought and climate change has forced Nale Sufi Ali to migrate to Mogadishu after she lost her livestock and their farmland dried. She now sells cashew nuts in the streets of Mogadishu to sustain her family.
I came from the Baidoa climate crisis, and drought forced us to migrate. I was a pastoralist and a farmer. Lack of rain caused the death of our livestock. We now live in this IDP camp, and we don't have beddings, and when it rains, it's unbearable to live. All we're asking for is government support.
Somalia has long had forbidding climate and dry desert conditions. Now the relentless drought has stripped millions of rural herders of their animals, their only real wealth, and driven humans close to scarce of water supplies. The main impact of climate change is severe drought, flash floods, locust infestation, and food insecurity.
The Ministry of Environment and Climate Change of Somalia has developed 5 years of strategy. The ministry has formulated and contributed the development of several significant policies, strategies, and programs at national level, including National Adaptation Plan, National Determined Contribution, National Climate Change Policy, and National Environment.
Somalia is one of the most affected countries by climate crisis, despite contributing less in global emissions. Climate crisis is now leading to a major displacement and humanitarian crisis in Somalia.
Climate change in Zambia is creating a hidden misery for millions. According to Save the Children, farming families in Zambia are experiencing a slow and silent climate crisis that has driven about 13% of the population into severe food shortages, and which is having a knock-on effect across the country.
I think just a lot of us just don't know. Like we don't know what's going on. We don't know the real climate issue. We don't know where to get the information from. Like on a global level, yeah, maybe.
As the country has been experiencing adverse impacts of climate change, including an increase in frequency and severity of seasonal droughts, occasional dry spells, increased temperatures in valleys, flash floods, and changes in the growing season.
The rain starts not at the same time anymore, and as such, in the agricultural spaces, we can't predict the planting time unless we observe the rainfall patterns and we receive early warning systems from the government and other scientific bodies.
In response to these impacts, Zambia is working to develop sustainable and appropriate programs for both crops and livestock in the face of climate change. Some of Zambia's adaptation measures include promotion of irrigation and efficient use of water resources, strengthening early warning systems and preparedness, and using GIS remote sensing and mapping of drought and flood-prone areas.
More than 2 billion people in the world cook over open fires, and it's no different in Kenya. They generate large amounts of smoke that pose huge environmental challenges, but a Kenyan company is working to solve two problems at once. Ramesa Choda has the story.
From wood to charcoal and now electricity, Kenya-based company Burn is producing more environmentally friendly cookstoves that help reduce carbon emissions that are not too expensive for people to buy.
Our improved cookstoves contain all the heat within the stove, so it reduces the losses to the environment. The aspect of reducing the wood that you burn is actually as a result of reducing the heat loss to the environment.
And it's down to the design. These stoves produce less smoke and harmful gases because of secondary air holes in the riser. These introduce more air into the flames, converting carbon monoxide into carbon dioxide. And thanks to the revenue from the sale of its carbon credits, the company is able to keep the cost of its stoves low, so more families can afford to buy them.
So the amount they were willing to pay for a stove was on average only about $12 versus like call it 40 to 50 in a purely commercial model that they would be required to pay for that stove. So there's this huge mismatch that has to be filled, and that's what now our entire business is operating on, finding ways to fill that gap between the actual cost to deliver that stove and the willingness to pay or the ability to pay for the mass market.
Many tea plantation workers in Kenya's Kiambu County have replaced their traditional stoves with the new fuel-efficient ones. Lois Wanjiku is one of them, and she says the burn cook stove is budget-friendly and better for her family's health.
Smoke no longer affects my eyes or gives me a cold because even if I cook with the stove in the sitting room, it doesn't smoke. The kids will be studying while you are cooking with no issue. Now we must look after finances because the children are in school and need money. Food has to be bought, so the stove is important in enabling us to save more.
The company says it has already sold more than 3 million stoves in the sub-Saharan region and raised $37 million in carbon finance in 2022. It's now planning to open an assembly line in Nigeria so that it can make and distribute more of them across West Africa and lower carbon emissions at the same time. Rumeisa Chodar, Africa Matters.
To Uganda now, where a coffee farmer is using modern technology like drip irrigation and artificial mulching to beat the effects of climate change. Coffee is a vital cash crop for the country, but extreme weather patterns are making its production increasingly tough, as Rahul Radhakrishnan reports.
Uganda is one of Africa's biggest exporters of coffee. The bean provides a livelihood for hundreds of thousands of households here. But nowadays, frequent droughts and rising temperatures brought about by the global climate crisis are threatening its production.
2019 we had a longer dry period, the rains came in about November, so that unpredictability makes the farmer's life impossible. You can't plan, you can't grow.
But Alan came up with a plan to use drip irrigation and a sort of artificial fertilizer to enrich the soil and keep his crops healthy.
So it's only going to worsen. I don't know what next year brings. I don't know when the next rain will be. But once you have water and you can mitigate this as much as possible, then the crop will not suffer.
His method creates a microclimate which keeps the soil moist and hydrated even when there's no rain.
When you work this out over 2 years for these young trees, they're going to grow, their root zone is going to be under very nice climate, as opposed to one using a hoe to do spot weeding, because the roots of coffees are very close to the ground. So for me, this artificial mulch has been honestly a game changer.
It's inspired other farmers too to leverage technology to protect their farms and crops. A huge water reservoir nearby supplies their fields with the water they need, powered by a solar pump. Adopting these new irrigation methods seem promising for overall production too.
So in Uganda, we've seen farmers maintain Coffea liberica valdiveri or excelsa coffee, and they are happy with its resilience to climate change. Farmers are proud to say that, yes, as we get these intense droughts, our liberica coffee production is not affected. So that's quite encouraging, and it also prompted us to further our understanding of liberica coffee.
Perhaps steps like these, along with a global commitment to change the climate crisis status quo, may make all the difference on the continent which remains the most vulnerable to its impact. Rahul Radhakrishnan, Africa Matters.
This week, we're exploring Lubango, a city in southwest Angola. Just as Rio de Janeiro has the famous Christ the Redeemer statue, Lubango boasts Cristo Rei, with the Son of God keeping watch over the city's 700,000 residents. Take a look. That's our show this week. Kindly share your thoughts and suggestions about the stories you've seen on this episode or ideas on what you would like us to cover on X, formerly known as Twitter, using the hashtag Africa Matters. Feel free to reach out to me on my personal handle @AdeshawaJosh. You can watch this episode and more on YouTube. Just search Africa Matters TRT World. Like, comment, and don't forget to share. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next week.